Hello, welcome to the End Game. I'm Tom Shanahan, and we discuss race and sports with an emphasis on Michigan State, but we also cover other issues. And today, my co-host again is Herman Bowles. Herman, how are you doing?
Doing great, Tom. Not so great after that Army-Navy game. But
yeah, that was a tough one. We'll have to get John's thoughts on that at the end. Well, today we're really honored. This is not Judy Woodruff and PBS or David Meredith and his podcast, but John Feinstein, we're very honored to have you on here to talk about your book, Raise a Fist, Take a Knee. And John, go ahead and start with some introductory comments about your book.
Well, Tom, it's good to be with both you guys. Thanks for having me. Raise a Fist, Take a Knee, as you might have guessed, is a book about race and sports. And that's a very broad topic. And I certainly didn't cover everything that needs to be covered in the book, but I've been around sports all my life, and thus have been around racial issues all my life. And in 2017, during the anthem protests, I was in an NFL stadium every Sunday because I was working on a book on playing quarterback in the NFL. And what I noticed every week was mostly black football players kneeling and mostly white football fans booing. And in most cases, I'm pretty sure they had no idea what they were booing about. They were listening to the rants of Donald Trump, or they were taking the approach that I think the Romans took toward the gladiators. You're here to entertain me. Don't do anything that interferes with my entertainment. And I went to see John Thompson, who I had known for almost 40 years at that point. And I said to him, I want to do a book about race and sports, but I don't know where to begin because it's such a huge topic. And John looked at me and he said, you might as well try to explain the Holy Trinity, which was probably an accurate statement. And then he pointed a finger at me and he said, which is why you need to do the book. And what he meant by that was, if one of my black colleagues, Kevin Blackistone, Michael Wilbon, two examples of guys I spoke to during the research of this book, had written a book like this, many would simply say, oh, it's just another black guy complaining. The flip side is, as a white person, I can't possibly understand what it's like to live life as a black person. But I did what I've done throughout my career. I talked to people. I did reporting. There were editors in publishing who said, how can you write a book about race and sports when you're not black? And my answer was, well, I've never been a college basketball coach. I've written books about that. I've never been a professional golfer, that's for sure. I've written books about that. I've never coached or played college or pro football. I've written books about that. It's all about the reporting. And I talked to about 100 people, not all of them black, but most of them black. And as I'm sure Herman can attest, having lived life as a black person, you can't understand it until you have awakened every morning. And as Ed Tapscott, who was the first black CEO of an NBA team, said to me, when you wake up as a black person, you have two jobs. One is your job. The other is to be black, because there will be people who will look at you differently. And the essence of this book is that my initial intent was find out why we're so polarized racially, that it's the elephant in the room in our country. But as I did my reporting, I realized that was almost like saying that Christmas is coming up as we sit here right now. It's a given that we're polarized. What I did learn from talking to all the people I talked to was in 2021, even though we've made tremendous progress since the days when black quarterbacks weren't smart enough to play the position, quote unquote, since the days of Jim Crow, which didn't become illegal till 1965, we made a lot of progress, but we still have a long, long way to go.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I'm proud to have Herman Bowles as my co-host is, like you say, John, I enjoy writing and researching about race and sports, but Herman lived it. Herman was the first black quarterback at his high school in Alabama, recruited to West Point when there weren't many blacks at West Point yet. And then he stayed in until he was a colonel, became, and he's now one of the top African-American businessmen in the country. Herman, your thoughts on what John had to say?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the completeness of his reporting. I appreciate his authenticity to indicate that he's not a black man, but he did his best to understand what it's like. And Ed's comment to you, John, or there actually some truth to that, because every day I get up, despite the success that I've had, if people don't know who I am, there are other assumptions that are made about who I am and what I represent, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just the polarization is just unfortunate. As we think back to all the opportunities for us to continue to build this great country, which I think we're going to overcome it in some way. And as I sit here and think about you talking about the protests, everything when this comes up, civil disobedience, I often think of the Boston Tea Party. And you think of the Boston Tea Party in the same sense, but people will have a problem making that parallel. Hey, that was about our freedom. Hey, well, this were people willing to take a stand. It's easy to take a stand when it's comfortable. It's very difficult to take a stand when it's uncomfortable and you're going to put something at risk. And those leaders that are going to go down making a difference are people that are willing to put something at risk. And it's something that I'm going to tell you, I've been emboldened to do that since my high school days. But during the last 3 years, I've been even more emboldened because you've heard me say this, Tom, too much is given, much is expected.
Well, I think it's funny you use that quote, Herman, because it's a quote one of your fellow Army alums uses all the time, Mike Krzyzewski, who was one of the people I talked to for this book. And I think anybody who has not looked at his Black Lives Matter video, which is 2 minutes and 47 seconds, should, because it shows you how a white person can be educated and can learn if his mind is open. Mike was in the military, obviously. He voted for both George Bushes for president, but in 2008, he voted for Barack Obama. And I remember seeing him after that election and giving him a hug and saying, my little boy is growing up. I won't repeat his response to that here. But the point you make about the Boston Tea Party, I think is very significant because people are going to say, what? And remember when Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fists in 1968, they were pilloried. Brent Musburger, who was then a columnist in Chicago, called them black-skinned stormtroopers and said, how dare they, when they were in Mexico City, quote, on the USOC's dime, did they use their platform for protest? Well, they were there because the USOC wanted them to win medals and bring glory to the United States, not because out of any act of generosity. But remember, back then they were thrown out of the Olympic movement. To many, they were pariahs. Now, I think to many, if not most, they're heroes. It took a long time to get to that point. And Tommy Smith said to me, I think there will come a day when Colin Kaepernick will be viewed that way. Colin Kaepernick, who was blackballed out of the NFL because he started the anthem protests. And we're seeing it happen slowly, but we're seeing it happen. And that's to your point where it's easy to protest when there's no risk involved. Tommy Smith and John Carlos protested when there was risk involved. Colin Kaepernick protested when there was risk involved, and he lost his career as a result. But those people who are looked at by some as pariahs often end up being looked at as heroes.
Yeah, and it's important to note that Brent Musburger has never apologized for that story that he wrote.
If you know Greg Popovich, you know that he's been very outspoken on many issues for many years. And he dates it to when he was in college at the Air Force Academy. Sorry to bring up a rival, Herman. When he and several of his teammates tried to go out to a club when they were on a road trip in North Carolina, and there were 4 of them. One of them was black. And when they got to the door, they were told by the bouncer that the black basketball player couldn't come in because he was black. This is in North Carolina in the late 1960s, so it's not that surprising knowing our history. But Greg said that was when his eyes were open to the fact that he was living life, to quote him, as a white boy. And I think guys like Popovich, guys like Steve Kerr, guys like Krzyzewski, Roy Williams, others understand that life is different. And when they hear people say, oh, race isn't an issue anymore, they know, because they've lived it, that it is very much a race. It is very much an issue today. And they find it, as I find it, upsetting. I mean, I get tweets all the time from people. You've seen them, Tom, because I know you follow me on Twitter, saying, well, why are you making, when I brought up the fact that, what's his name? The guy, Mitchell Trubisky, was drafted before Patrick Mahomes and before Deshaun Watson. And I asked Doug Williams, if Watson and Mahomes had been white, where would they have been drafted? And Doug Williams said, ahead of Trubisky. And I said, well, Trubisky went number 2. And he said, exactly. And then when I brought that quote up to Tony Dungy, and Tony Dungy is not exactly a jump on a chair and scream guy, he said, well, you asked the question to Doug wrong. I said, what do you mean? He said, what you should have asked was, where would Trubisky have gone had he been black? The way Lamar Jackson didn't go to the last pick in the first round, because he was black. And we all know how that's turned out. But when I bring stuff like that up, people say, oh, you're trying to make race an issue. People make mistakes in the draft. People do make mistakes in the draft. But sometimes they make mistakes in the draft because they want to draft someone who looks, quote unquote, like an NFL quarterback. Although that look has changed a lot in the last 10 years, hasn't
it? Yeah. Robert?
Yeah. Well, look, I think that the opportunity, let's go back to the quarterback thing. And, as Tom said, John, back at Coffee High School and Lawrence, Alabama, back in the early 70s, Tom actually spoke to my coach, and I learned some things I didn't even know. That my coach, who's still living, retired Major General Buddy Moore, basically told Tom that he caught crap for playing me at quarterback, because that was not the time or the opportunity that we were expected to be at. I mean, despite the fact that I was president of the Student Council, Honor Society, Boys State, and everything else, but still in the community at large, the common thought was, the black kid can't play quarterback, and I think, and John, it's amazing that you say that, because you think in sports is the ultimate meritocracy, right? It's the ultimate meritocracy where coaches want to win, players want to win, the fans want to win, yet there can be this overdraft of racism, which can creep in because something doesn't look the way it's supposed to look.
Right.
And
I'm sorry, Herman, go ahead.
No, I said, until we can get that down, I mean, the military and sports, these are things that I've spent a lot of my time in, and we really get that meritocracy there. We're going to be a better country.
Well, you're right. And I think sports has been, if not the ultimate meritocracy, a meritocracy in our country. I mean, Jackie Robinson played for the Dodgers 7 years before Brown v. School Board, and 18 years before Jim Crow was finally outlawed and before voting rights laws were passed. And Gary Williams, the great Maryland basketball coach, who grew up in Camden, New Jersey, said one of the reasons he loved the schoolyard to play ball was because nobody cared if he was white, even though virtually everybody else was black. They just wanted to know, can you play? And I think we see that to a large degree because, like you said, teams want to win, coaches want to win, players want to win. That's why 75% of the players in the NFL today are black. And we've made progress certainly in that area, in the NBA, college athletics too. But when it comes to positions of authority, it's not so much a meritocracy. That's why only 3 of 32 NFL coaches are black. That's why Eric Bieniemy, who has run the best offense in football, for the last 4 years as offensive coordinator of the Kansas City Chiefs, has had 11 interviews for head coaching jobs and hasn't gotten a job yet. And the excuse is, well, he doesn't call the plays. Andy Reid calls the plays. Well, Doug Peterson, who was Andy Reid's coordinator, didn't call the plays. He ended up coaching a Super Bowl team in Philadelphia. Matt Nagy, who's been the Bears coach for the last 4 years, didn't call the plays when he was the coordinator in Kansas City. And when Andy Reid was an assistant coach, he's considered the best play caller in football now. He didn't call the plays. So it's excuse making. And that's why Tony Dungy gets so upset when he brings up the fact that 2 of the last 20 hires in the NFL have been black head coaches. And people say, why are you making race an issue? And the answer, as Greg Popovich said, is because race is an issue. And both Mike Tomlin and Tony Dungy, who I think are two of the smartest people I've interviewed on any of my books, said the same thing to me about Roger Goodell. They said they think he is embarrassed by the situation. Maybe that's why he refused to talk to me for this book, because he's embarrassed, but that he can't do anything because the owners run the league. He doesn't give up $44 million a year by going in and saying, damn it, you got to hire some more black coaches, which he should do. But I understand why he's protecting $44 million a year. Everybody talks about Tom Brady and then what a great job he's done since he's gone to Tampa Bay. Well, he's had a pretty good offensive coordinator in Byron Leftwich, who is a NFL quarterback and who still hasn't gotten a sniff at a head coaching job.
Yeah, and the last couple of years that Bieniemy didn't get hired, I compared it to Jimmy Ray, who was talked about as one of the first possible black head coaches in the late 80s, and he never got his chance. And so I think that things really haven't changed between Jimmy Ray in the late 80s, bringing Michigan State into this, and Eric Bieniemy today. It's still basically the same issue.
Well, and Jimmy Ray's son has dealt with the same thing. 30 years later, after Jimmy Ray was a coordinator all those years in the 80s and 90s in the NFL, he, as you know, because you've dealt with him so much, Tom, he's very quotable. And he said to me, I guess they said I was good enough to play in the band, just not good enough to lead the band.
Yeah, and I think you compared, you're talking about Jimmy Ray III, his son, who had wanted to be a general manager and looked like he was on that path in his time with the Chargers. And I think you compared his resume to a guy with the Ravens who's now a general manager, right? Yeah, yes. Talk about that.
Yeah, Eric DeCosta, who succeeded Ozzie Newsome. Ozzie Newsome was the first black general manager in the NFL.
And John, real quickly, Ozzie and I graduated the same year and we're friends back in Alabama. So,
were you really?
Yeah.
So I'm sure you know Ozzie well. And again, Ozzie's another one of those guys who doesn't jump up on tables and shout. But Eric DeCosta succeeded Ozzie. He worked under Ozzie. He started as a scout and worked his way up. And succeeded Ozzie when Ozzie retired a couple of years ago. His job ascension was almost identical to Jimmy Ray III, except that Ozzie made sure. Now Eric's white, but Ozzie didn't care if he was white or black. He just knew he was the perfect person to succeed him, and Ozzie made sure that he got the job. Nobody did that for Jimmy Ray III, and he's never gotten a chance to be a general manager. What's interesting about Ozzie, Herman, is in 1970, when he was 14 years old, he tried out for a Pop Warner football team. And he said when the coaches said, okay, quarterback's there, linebackers there, running back's there, he started to walk towards the quarterbacks because he always played quarterback in the schoolyard because he was the best player. And as he started walking there, he said everybody else was white. And he said, well, they're not going to let me play quarterback. The only person who played quarterback as a professional at that point was Marlon Briscoe with the Denver Broncos in 1968, played 11 games, was second in the Rookie of the Year voting, and never got another chance to play quarterback after that year. So Ozzie said, they're not going to let me play quarterback. So he went over with the receivers and, of course, ended up as a Hall of Fame receiver. But what he said to me that was interesting was it's 50 years later, and I still think you have to be twice as good to be a general manager, a coach, even a quarterback. Now, we've got great quarterbacks in the NFL, black quarterbacks right now, obviously. But again, Mitchell Trubisky got drafted ahead of Patrick Mahomes. Lamar Jackson got drafted behind 4 white quarterbacks who went in the top 10, and it took Ozzie, a black general manager, to select him. And the other thing is, how many black backup quarterbacks are there in the NFL? Not very many. If you're not a star, they usually don't want you playing the position.
John, it's so funny. You're saying that story about Ozzie and the Recreation League football. The exact same thing happened to me. I was playing in the Florence League. I could throw the ball further than anybody just out playing. And when it came time to do what you said, at least Ozzie went over to the receivers. They told me to go over with the lineman, and I played guard. Okay. I was a skinny little kid, but it was so amazing. And people, I like to think, I always give people the benefit of the doubt. That they don't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to be prejudiced. I'm going to be a jerk today. What happens, and I try to do this in all the speaking I do, we all have a quadrant that we don't know that we don't know. And those of us who are lifelong learners can recognize that quadrant. And I can respect someone that may have had that ignorant view if they have the ability to say, I didn't know that I didn't know. And that's the key, what we've got to do to make this society better, make people understand.
The line you just used, I think, Herman, is the most important line is learners, being learners throughout our lives. I remember Dean Smith, who, again, not only a great basketball coach, but played a major role in 1958 in desegregating restaurants at Chapel Hill when he first got to North Carolina as an assistant. But I remember he always used to say, I hope I'm a better coach today than I was a year ago. I hope I'll be a better coach a year from now than I am now. And that's the learning process, that no matter how much, I've always said the best teachers are the best learners. And if people have an open mind, like as you can imagine, I've gotten tweets and things from people about this book saying, I don't want to read this book. I don't want to hear about your liberal blah, 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 blah. And my response, I don't care if they read the book. If their mind's that closed, it doesn't matter. But what I do hope is that people will be open-minded enough to read the book and hear what people who've had the experience of being Black and dealing with everything that comes with that have to say. Not what I have to say. What I have to say is irrelevant. I'm just here to tell you what the people I interviewed had to say, because that is important. And I think people will learn, to use your word, Herman, from it. And I guarantee, I can sit here, I've never met you, and guarantee that at some point in your life you've been stopped for DWB, driving while Black.
Oh my gosh, yes. And most people,
life is about Black person.
Yeah, and most people don't understand here, as a Black parent, there's this thing, and John, I don't know if you've heard about it, it's called the talk.
The talk.
Okay? And when my kids started driving, you talk to them, and this was before all these horrific events of the last 18 months. You say, if you are stopped, keep your hands on the steering wheel.
Yep.
Treat the officer with the utmost respect and call them sir. And one of my sons, all my kids were athletes, and one of my sons, my middle son, he is bullheaded. He's emotional. And I had to particularly tell him, he has this righteousness of fairness and et cetera. So you cannot change the world. And when you're in a precarious situation, it's hard to take a bullet back.
Yeah. And it's funny you bring that up, because Mike Tomlin, who has sons who are now 21 and 19, told me the story about giving his sons the talk. And his older son, probably like your middle son, looked at, oh, come on, Dad. That doesn't happen anymore. It's 2016 or whatever the year was. We live in a nice neighborhood. And Mike said, just wait. 3 times in the first year, he was stopped for DWB. First question, where'd you get this car? Always the first question. And the unique story that I came across in researching this book was Cullen Jones, the Olympic swimmer, who told me a story about taking his dog for a walk in Charlotte, where he lives, and a cop did a U-turn and came back to him and said, where did you get that dog? And Cullen said, my dog. And he said, now what kind of dog is it? The Bulldog Terrier. How long have you had it? Since he was a puppy 7 years ago. And finally the cop said, okay, and drove away. And I said to Cullen, well, you're the first person I've interviewed who got stopped for WDWB, walking dog while Black. But it does, we know it happens. And you're right, Herman. Kenny Williams, the vice president of the White Sox, told me a story about getting pulled over by a cop in a construction zone where you couldn't drive more than 15 miles an hour. And he saw the cop pull out of traffic, go around 3 cars, come up behind him and pull him over. And he said to the cop, "What are you doing? Why are you picking me out of this crowd?" And of course, the cop said, "Well, you were speeding." And he said, "I couldn't have been speeding if I wanted to be." And he said, finally, he just showed him his license and registration. And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I didn't want to die." And that's a thought that runs through. When I get stopped for speeding, the thought that I'm going to die doesn't run through my mind. It did when I was a teenager because I knew my dad might kill me. But I didn't think I was going to die during the traffic stop. But when you're black and it's at night, you have to be a little bit scared, if not a lot of bit scared. And the funny thing about the Kenny Williams story is he went to court. He told the judge what had happened. And the judge looked at the cop and said, "I drive through that construction zone on my way to work. You can't speed if you want to. Charge dismissed." So that's the reality of the life.
Well, let me tell you a very scary one I had. It was my junior year at West Point. A buddy and I were driving back from Alabama, and we were somewhere in Kentucky. And I had a little 280Z, so two black guys in a sports car. And, we were definitely going the speed limit and maybe going 5 over, right? So we're in this little town and the cop comes up, he stops us. And I'm going to tell you, this guy was out of the heat of the night.
Yeah.
Okay. He just had all of the characteristics that you would want. And I must admit, I was trying to play off my, West Point status. And I gave him my card, my driver's license. I was driving. Then I gave him my West Point ID. I said, "Sir, I'm a cadet at West Point, been on vacation, head back to West Point now." And we're going, he said, "I don't care where you from." And he used a word that I'm not going to use here. And he took the license and the ID card and he took us back about 20 miles. And I'm going to tell you, me and my buddy, I'm having dinner with that buddy tonight, Richard Lewis, we thought we were going to die. We go in and the sheriff's station was an old grain station I walked in, there's this little poor looking kid in a diaper, and he puts us in the elevator, takes us upstairs. They actually had a cell there, and he kept us there for an hour and a half. Just, didn't, right up to the borderline, if you know what I'm saying. Then he finally said, "Okay, I'm going to let you boys go, but you got to understand, you come in my county, you better drive safely." And it was just the most, West, he said, "I don't care from East Point. I don't give a damn." And it was just,
you know why he did it, Herman? Because he could. And that's one of the biggest problems we have. And that's why, think about this for 1 second. If not for the fact that George Floyd's murder was recorded, I don't think Derek Chauvin even would have been charged. And that's one thing that has changed for the good in our country. And to me, the most important thing about the Black Lives Matter protests, and you guys both, I'm sure, have white friends who said, "Oh, they were out of control, they were this, they were that." For the most part, they weren't. But the most important thing about the Black Lives Matter protests was that there were a lot of white people involved.
yes.
But finally, there are those of us who are white who are waking up. Mike Krzyzewski is a perfect example.
Well, John, we call those allies, right? And we know true allies are people that stand for a cause without, again, their own personal aggrandizement being important.
Exactly right. Yeah. And while Floyd's murder was obviously a tragedy, it was good to see some of the response to what happened.
Yeah, and telling that story, Herman, I think it's important to note it's only a little more than a decade after Cheney, Goodwin, and I'm drawing a blank on the third name, down in Mississippi, where they were killed when they were pulled over. John, one of the things that I think makes your book work, and we've touched on this already with all the different stories we've discussed, is, people might read in a newspaper or a magazine an isolated incident that happens to a black man or a black athlete or coach or whatever, where you have such a wide collection of people, like Tony Dungy, that most white fans would be surprised that they have to go through all that.
No, I think that's a very good point. Again, Tony Dungy has never been a stand on a table and yell guy, and neither's Ozzie Newsome, and Mike Tomlin is as respected as anybody in the NFL, black or white, or at least should be. I think he is. And again, basketball coaches, I was lucky I talked to John Thompson before he got sick. As I said, I knew John for years, as smart as anybody I've ever known, which is why I went to him for advice when I knew I wanted to write a book like this. And I talked to Nolan Richardson. People know that Nolan Richardson was the second black coach to win an NCAA title. I doubt if they know what he went through as a boy, as a college player, and as a young coach, and as an older coach, frankly. And so, as you said, I try to talk to a broad range of people. I talked to people in baseball. I talked to Willie Randolph, who was a successful manager with the Mets, never got a second chance. White managers get recycled in baseball the way we recycle bottles.
And coaches in the NFL as well, and college coaches.
Yes, very much so. But the best example to me is Jeff Torborg. Very nice guy, knew him well, who managed 5 Major League Baseball teams, never won a division title. Willie took the Mets from 71 wins the year before he got there to 97, his second year. Got fired in his 4th year and never got another job. Never. How is that possible? And Dave Stewart, who got a brief chance to be a general manager with the Arizona Diamondbacks, and on and on through other sports, even golf. Harold Varner III, very good player on the PGA Tour, who told the story. And Harold, again, Harold's not a, come on, we got to do this guy. But he and his wife pulled up to the front entrance of the Greenbrier for a golf tournament 2 years ago. And the guy at the door said, caddies park outside. Just saw a black face and automatically assumed he was a caddy. And I don't, as Harold said, I don't think he was being racist. It was just what he was used to, his environment had produced. And so I did try to talk to as many different kinds of people from as many different kinds of backgrounds as I could to gather these stories.
Yeah. The other thing I want both of you guys to comment on, and I find this very perplexing, is how can a guy like John Gruden, who revealed who he really is when he was fired, be around the NFL and black athletes for so long and still have those attitudes? And then similarly, LSU coach Ed Orgeron openly supporting Trump when probably 80% of his players are black. How can you be so tone deaf? That explains a lot of the problem, and people in management don't get it, right?
Right. Well, tone deaf is the right phrase, because a lot of guys just don't get it, and a lot of it is based on their background and where they come from. And to me, the most significant thing I heard John Gruden say in the wake of what led to his firing was, "I don't have a racist bone in my body." Well, that to me is just lack of self-awareness. I think he honestly believes that he's not a racist. It's like, the old cliche about a lot of my best friends are black. And I use this line in the book that Scarlett O'Hara treated Mammy like family, but we all know what kind of family she was. And that's what I'm talking about with Gruden, with Orgeron, with other coaches, who have those attitudes. They think they're treating their black players like family, quote unquote, but would they have them over to their house for dinner if they weren't recruiting them? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's look, these guys are generally smart enough to know how to keep their politics away from their day job, and the true feelings. And Gruden, I got to tell you, I was, Chucky, I was such a big fan of his. He's just something else. I love feisty people who are underdogs and come up and win. And I cannot tell you how disappointed I was when I heard all of that. Oregon, I wasn't too surprised with that. I guess there are other things that were going on at LSU.
And by the way, there are plenty other white coaches who have those attitudes. They just, you look at Jack Nicklaus, for example, the golfer, who I've known for years and who was always great to me, gave me interview time, very smart in his answers. And he was a wild-eyed Trump supporter. And I said to him, when Trump was running the first time, I said after he endorsed him, I said to him, I had interviewed him at length for a book I did on the Ryder Cup. And I said, "Okay, Jack, I'm turning off my tape recorder. Off the record. Donald Trump? And he said, oh, Donald's always been very nice to you. I said, you're Jack blanking Nicholas. Of course he's nice to you. That's not the test. But he didn't get it. My good friend Tom Watson, who I've run a charity golf tournament with for years, doesn't get it. It's unfortunately still a long list. That's what Herman's talking about the progress we still need to make.
I was so disappointed in Jack Nicklaus. I have a picture of him from La Costa where he signed it for me and he said, thanks for the help on my putt. And if Trump had won again in this most recent election, I was going to have to take that picture down. I was just so heartbroken.
My wife and I were sitting the night on election night talking about where we could move if Trump was reelected, and we were dead serious.
One more question I want to, John Gruden reminded me, both of you maybe comment on this. As I remember when Gruden was in his 30s, he was getting written about almost every day, magazines, newspapers, as the boy wonder. He's going to be a head coach someday. And sure enough, he was. He was in his 30s. You never hear about a black coach like a Jimmy Ray as the boy wonder. That's a big problem, too, with the media, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, look at some of the head coaches in the NFL today. Sean McVay got hired by the Rams when he was 30. He was a wunderkind, and he's done very, very well. Now everybody in the NFL wants to hire the next Sean McVay, a guy who's young, who looks good with the semi-beard and all that stuff. And that's who they hired in San Diego. That's who they hired in Cincinnati. The list goes on. Eric Bieniemy's now 51. He's been a coach in the NFL now for 15 years. Byron Leftwich is in his 40s. He's still a relatively young coach, but when does he get the opportunity? And you're right. And Mike Tomlin was an exception to the rule. He got hired as a head coach in Pittsburgh when he was 34. And that's because, to quote the late Dan Rooney, he blew them away in his interview. And if you've ever talked to Mike Tomlin, you can understand why he would blow someone away in the interview. He did the same thing with Tony Dungy when Tony Dungy first hired him as an assistant in Tampa. But it's a lot harder to be a boy wonder if you're black than if you're white, because the image we have of boy wonders is John Gruden and Sean McVay.
And Lane Kiffin.
And Lane Kiffin is a great example, a guy who just kept falling up from one job to another, and finally seems to have found a niche at Mississippi, although I guarantee you he'll be back in the NFL in the next 2 or 3 years.
Well, do you see that in the business world too, with young, rising executives and college graduates?
As they say, there is nothing unique about organizations and people. So the process is the same in terms of my colleagues in an organization. I'm in the Executive Leadership Council. Often say, and John's already mentioned today, you got to work twice as hard. You got to be twice as good just to stay up and be competitive. And I can tell you, things have really changed, particularly at the senior level of board composition over the last 18 months. Okay. 30% of the people who were selected to go on public company boards in the last 12 months have been black. So the process is going. I was in Park City out at Deer Valley giving a speech last week, as a matter of fact. And I looked up in the audience, 600 people. And there was one black person over here and one black person over there, and I was on the lecture. And I talked about some of these issues, and I had no idea how it was going to be taken. Let me tell you, when I finished my speech and I talked about the reason I was speaking about ESG, which is the big buzzword in corporate America now, environmental, social, and governance. And I spent some time on the social, and I said, look, this is not a charitable situation. This is not a social situation. This is a business situation. Because look at right now, people under 18, majority of them in America are people of color, non-white. And between 2035 and 2040 or 2042, the majority of people in America are going to be non-white. So if you're a business individual, you got to think of the following. Who am I going to hire? What products am I going to make for the markets? Who's going to sell those products? And who's going to buy those products? And if you don't have that perspective at the top of your organization, you're not going to be competitive in the long run. And that's just a fact.
Yeah. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention Sherman Lewis, who also was a black coach that Duffy Daugherty hired in 1969, hired Jimmy Ray in 1972. Both of those guys should have been a head coach in the NFL. Sherman told me a story about how they were just the Rooney Rule interviews, just so that they interview a black candidate. The Cowboys had told him that there was going to be they're flying him in, secret interview. He gets to the airport, every TV station in Dallas, Fort Worth area is there.
Oh, they wanted that publicity.
The Cowboys can document that they interviewed a black guy. But I also need to add, no school did more and no coach did more than Michigan State and Duffy Daugherty for the integration of college football. And Duffy hired both Jimmy Ray and Sherman Lewis as black coaches when there were very few black college coaches. Yep, when Duffy was gone, he wasn't a part of the program anymore. He's retired. The people that are in charge of the administration failed to recognize the history that had been made here. And they didn't hire either Jimmy Ray or Sherman Lewis as a head coach, even though both would have considered it the best job they ever had in their life. So I have to bring that up about my alma mater, too. Let's wrap this up and maybe talk a little bit about the Army-Navy game, John, and then both, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, both Herman and John know Coach K, going back to Coach K at West Point. So maybe both you guys can tell a story about how he's basically the same guy now as he was then. I know, Herman, you've told me that as far as the coaching you've observed.
Yeah, well, I'll start on Coach K real quickly, John. I want to take my kids down. Army played West Point, and I'm a pretty significant giver to West Point. I call our athletic director, Mike Buddy, up, and I said, "Hey, Mike, I think I'm going to take my kids down. I got a board meeting down in North Carolina. I'm going to go over to the Army game." He said, "Herman, I'll check with you. We got 40 tickets." Right? I said, "You can't negotiate better than that." So, long story short, I said Coach K a note. I mean, when you know people like that, and I think the thing to do is you don't bug them all the time. Now, I'm on his board at the Center of Leadership and Ethics down at Duke. We obviously the last 2 years haven't been able to have that event, but he comes around with all these corporate people, spends time. We go to practice, do everything. But Coach K said, "Herman, how many tickets you need?" I said, "I need 8. I had 8 tickets right behind the bench. And, he set it up. So he's that type of way. And John, the story I tell, I had a radio show at West Point when Coach K was just in his rookie year. And it was Thursday night. I'm sorry?
When he was still Mike.
When he was still Mike, you got it. And he called me up to ask to be on my show Thursday Night Live. And I'll never forget the interview, because he wanted, he understood then that, you needed fan support. He understood marketing in addition to the X and O's. And I've got a letter over here when he won his 1,000th game. I wrote him a note, basically said, "Hey, Coach, congratulations." Because I travel with the team, so I spent a lot of time with him. So I know his language, okay, as both of you do as well. And he said, "Thank you, Herman. I owe my entire career to being on your show."
That sounds like Mike. I'll tell you just 2 quick stories because I know we've got to wrap up. When my father died in 2006, his funeral was on a Tuesday, and Duke was playing at North Carolina that night. And I got home. Of course, it was a late tip, and I got home, turned on the game, and fell sound asleep shortly after tip-off. And I woke up. It was about 1 minute and 30 left in the game, and watched the end of the game. Duke won a close game, typical Duke North Carolina game. And by then, because I'd fallen asleep, I was wired. I knew I wasn't going to sleep anyway. So I sat down right here at my desk and started catching up on emails from people and things. And the phone rang. And a voice said, this is before caller ID, "I figured you'd still be up." And it was Mike. And he said, "I just wanted you to," and I said, "Hey, congrats, great win, whatever." He said, "I just wanted you to know when I stepped into our last huddle there with 30 seconds left, I looked up at the sky and I said, 'Martin, this one's for you.'" And I didn't know how he knew my dad's name. But he did, and he took the time 45 minutes after a huge win to call me to let me know he was thinking about me. and the loss of my father. And that's who Mike Krzyzewski is. Now, the other side is, because I'm a little bit of a wise guy, Duke actually during one stretch lost 5 times out of 6 to Notre Dame, and I think they've beaten them like 12 straight since then. But during that stretch, the football team at Duke somehow beat Notre Dame. And I was on my way to the Ryder Cup 2016, and I pulled my car over to the side of the road, and I sent Mike a text. And I just said very simply, I'm glad Duke has finally found a sport it can beat Notre Dame in. And in under 10 seconds, the answer came back. It was 2 words, and the first one rhymed with duck. And so that's Mike. He's always got a sense of humor, as you said, Hermit. But deep down, you'll never have a better friend. And he's a pretty good basketball coach too.
Pretty good.
Okay, let's wrap up. Each of us will make one Army-Navy game comment. It was such a great game. The thing that struck me, John, was on the fake field goal, the center audibleized the snap to forgo, and the long snapper's name is Ethan Nguyen, Nguyen, as in Vietnamese. Who could imagine 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, I should say, that someone named Nguyen would be at one of the academies making big plays in the Army-Navy game? Is this a great country or what?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's a plebe too. So Navy had a very young team this year. They had a very tough year. The cliche goes, if you beat Army or you beat Navy, it makes your whole season. In this case, it did.
It's true.
For Navy to win the game. And Bob Sutton, who you probably know, Herman, who coached
I know him very well
for years, used to say the more desperate team wins the Army-Navy game. I thought Navy played more desperately. And that's why they won. They deserved to win. They were the better team after that first touchdown drive in the first quarter. They really dominated the game, to be honest. Army already knew it was keeping the Commander-in-Chief's trophy. It already knew it was going to a bowl. Navy wanted to salvage something from its season, and it did with that win.
I agree with you 100%, John. I mean, people were telling me beforehand that, this is going to be a smash mouth. You guys are going to, I said, you just don't understand this rivalry. I mean, records mean nothing. And, going through it a couple of years as a player and seeing my son go through it as a player for 4 years, the fans. And I tell you what was exciting for me as I looked out over that stadium and saw that full stadium and, America coming together and my good friend and seeing my good friend, Defense Secretary out, doing that's what makes America.
I better seeing him do the coin toss than Donald Trump. I'll tell you that.
Well, that was okay. Well, Lloyd, I'll see him tomorrow, as a matter of fact, at an event. But in any event, to summarize what John said, Navy wanted it more. I think Army, the players, and Coach Monken's usually good about this, but I think there was a little bit of a superiority complex, and getting that early touchdown didn't help. It would have almost been better for them to have to scrabble a little more. And then when they tried to, it's sort of like running the 2 miles that we used to have to do in the Army all the time. You think you're going to save it up for the end and then you're going to really finish. Doesn't work like that. You got to go from start to finish and you got to give it all you got. And Navy wanted it more. Navy played better. Navy deserved to win. It's unfortunate. The better team that day was Navy.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, and one more thought. I just thought about this. I was on a Zoom call with some of the Army players, John, before the game, a week before the game, Nolan Cockrell and Andre Carter. And I asked these guys, one of my favorite books, sports books, is your book, A Civil War, on the Army-Navy rivalry. And I asked both those guys, I said, John Feinstein wrote this book before you guys were even born. How much do you know about it? And they didn't know anything about it. Yeah. They said they were going to look up, they were going to check out the book and look it up. But I think you need to call Coach Monken and Coach Diamantolo and tell them this should be required reading.
I'll try to do that. I'll try to do that, Tom. Although
that's actually a great idea, Tom.
That a lot of when I'm at the 2 academies, a lot of cadets and mids come up to me and say that one of the reasons they went to the academy was reading A Civil War. So I guess it works both ways. And maybe we need to get our football players reading more, period. Get them to raise a fist, take a knee.
Well, our guys are reading right now because Army is in term-in examinations this
They
week.
are.
And they won't finish until Friday. And then obviously they got to get a game plan together. So, you can't pick your parents and you generally don't pick your bowl game. So what can I say?
True.
Okay, great. Once again, John, it was a pleasure having you on here.
Thank you. Thank you,
John.
both. Happy holidays to both of you.
Sounds great, John. Tom,
Cheers.
thank you as usual for your leadership pulling this together. And I think these archives, 20 or 30 years from now, I hope people are listening to this and basically saying, I can't believe that's the way it was.